Dr. Shakuntala Banaji is Professor of Media, Culture and Social Change and Director for the MSc in Media, Communication and Development in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She is also chair of the Research Ethics Committee at LSE and co-chair of the International Communication Association Conference 2022. She lectures in development and communication, world cinema, international media and disinformation, and is the winner of the 4th European Prize for Excellence in Teaching in the Humanities and Social Sciences and the Dinner Prize 2015, as well as a host of other teaching excellence prizes. She has participated in several large cross-European projects on young people, new technologies, schooling and democratic participation between 2006 and 2018. Was UK project director of Multi-Country Horizon 2020 project, Catch EYOU on the youth active citizenship in Europe from 2015 to 2018, and principal investigator for a collaborative grant with American University, Sharjah, on young people's participatory culture, the internet and the creative production in the Middle East. Her first monograph, Reading Bollywood, is a critical ethnography of Hindi cinema viewing. Now, other books include her edited collection, South Asian Media Cultures, Anthem Press, The Civic Web, Young People and Internet and Civic Participation, jointly authored with David Buckingham, MIT Press, Young People and Democratic Life, co-authored with Bart Kamarads, Children and Media in India, Narratives of Class, Agency and Social Change, published by Routledge, and Youth Active Citizenship in Europe, co-edited with Sam Mejius for Palgrave. And the upcoming book is Social Media and Hate, authored with Ram Bhatt. That will be out in on I think 1st January 2022. And I'm really interested to listen to Professor Banaji, as my topic of PhD is changing perception of politics and democracy through social media since 2012. So as I said, that social media is becoming a distinct phenomenon, and the ground and the political battleground is significantly different, and the middle ground is also changing. Especially we have seen 2014 Lok Sabha election in India, 2016 Brexit, even US elections, and what has happened with Cambridge Analytica, even with Namo app. And as I mentioned in my, when I was talking that there is book by Swati Chaturvedi, I'm a Troll. And recently, before 2019 Lok Sabha election, there was book by Pratik Sinha, who is founder of Alt News, fact-checking website, which is India Misinformed. And generally, we think that all these countries are underdeveloped or developing countries, and they are not aware about the situation. But the same thing was happening in Brexit. There is cinema on Brexit, how it actually carried out. And again, there is documentary, The Great Hack, which also tells you that what manipulations are taking place. Even we know that right now there is trollers community and there is cyber cell and how it functions. Okay, so that's absolutely fine. So I think without wasting much time, I would like to request Professor Banaji that how do you see social media? Because on one hand, we know that it is considered as the 5th pillar of democracy. At the same time, it is the tool for autocracy. And precisely that was emphasized by The Economist when it said that 146 million Americans were disinformed or misinformed because of Russian trollers and Russian misinformers. If that is the case of America, what do you think about UK, Brazil, and India? So without wasting much time, I would like to request Professor Banaji. It's over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sriranjan, for that very gracious invitation and introduction. And also thank you to colleagues for wonderful presentations this morning. I shall try to be rather brief because I know we are running out of time, but I would like to get the slides right at the beginning.
Madam,
so
we can extend the time. You know, yes,
okay. Okay. Well, I'm going to try and share my slides. Please let me know when you can see whether you can see everything. It's going to take me a minute to just set it all up and then we'll be ready. Here we go. Can everybody see my slides?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And just give me 10 seconds. I just want to make sure that I am able to see some of you. Okay. So today's talk is based largely on the work I've been doing in the last 5 years with a variety of colleagues, mostly around democratic participation in Europe and Turkey and on the use of new media. But of course, it's underpinned by 2 decades of work on histories of politics, media use from film, television, and older media. So what I bring to the conversation, I hope, is a sense of how things are changing, but also how things are staying the same. And therefore, some of the issues that I want to tackle today really will be around the problems with thinking of new media as entirely separate from the histories of old media use and politics as we've seen them in previous years. The research that I've drawn on previously, you can find quite easily. Much of it is available free online, and some of it is available for download from the LSE website. But also it comes in a series of books, which I know are available in some of your libraries. And I'm very happy to send people PDFs of things if you can't find them online. So do get in touch. To give a flavor of our work, today I'm hoping to outline some assumptions that people make in the literature that we've been reading, particularly around hate speech, trolling, discrimination, and political violence or lynching that have dominated scholarship on new media. Of course, there's a lot of very good scholarship, and I'll reference that too, but I'm majorly interested in disrupting some of the perhaps liberal consensus around what trolling and hate speech are doing and why they're around. I'm going to use examples from our last 2-year project, which was in Brazil, India, Myanmar, and the UK, to illustrate a typology of hateful communication online in terms of perpetrators, recipients, and message content. Typologies are not new, and of course, we build on typologies from other colleagues to do this. But in this case, we found in the typology of hate that we came up with for our project on WhatsApp in 2019, that there was a very strong ideological dimension to a typology. And we also draw some brief conclusions about hateful disinformation and ways to combat tactically or through policy approaches, hateful disinformation and hate speech online. So here I reference in this slide some of the assumptions about the field that we're going into. What's called hate is actually random trolling. It only happens if you go online too much. It's a feature of online interaction. I've read a lot of quantitative studies which seem to suggest that if you are a user of internet or social media in Brazil or India or Myanmar or Indonesia or Pakistan or Bangladesh, and if you don't go online, you won't encounter hate. Now, on the one hand, that's completely banal. You don't go online, you don't get hate. And they say that if you go online and you speak up, then you're likely to become 20 times more likely, 30 times more likely to become the butt of trolling. But this fact, which may or may not be true and which is true for some groups and not for others, hides much more than it reveals and is actually misleading, because there are certain people who can be online for 10 years, use internet very intensely, use social media very intensely, and they don't get trolled. So one of the things that we were interested in looking at was, why do some people online and some groups online get trolled and hate speech and dehumanized far more than others? Second point, which we come up with in loads and loads of popular media and literature across both the European Union and Asia, that clueless and cunning social media companies, so one or the other, they're either clueless or they're cunning, with very lax policies, are responsible for a rise in hate and hate crimes. And I hear people a lot of the time saying, oh, look, Frances Haugen has just talked about Facebook, has just given us the lowdown on what Facebook have been doing. Now we know why And then they'll say things like why lynchings are happening, why WhatsApp is being used for this, that, or the other. So this is the displacement theory, something that happened a lot in previous decades, where people used to say, oh, it's because of television that violence happens, or oh, it's because of films that violence happens. Here, this is the displacement onto the media companies and onto social media itself. Then people say that it's the affordances of social media which are responsible for a rise in hateful materials and misinformation, because social media allows you to be anonymous, or because I'm hoping and found. Then you've just referred to this, of course, you've just referred to this, of course, in your introduction, but of course, there are these multiple, surely it's all down to Russia, or it's all down to Pakistan. It's all of these foreign nations, their bots, their sock puppet accounts, the troll farms, which are targeting democratic countries like the UK, democratic countries like the US, democratic countries like India, and flooding our public spheres with hate. Anybody who's been even, dipped a toe into the waters of social media in India recently, of course, is going to know that that is absolutely not true, but we're going to take that to pieces during the talk. And then there are two final points that we have dug out from much of the policy literature in regard to hate speech and social media. One of them is that, how do you tackle hate speech? Well, they say, well, you need to have media literacy. So I ask, why do you need to have media literacy? And then people say, because it's media illiterate people, or just illiterate citizens, who are spurring the rise of mediated misinformation, because they pass on things without reading or understanding them. And you'll remember, of course, no one in India could forget the 2018 spate of mob lynchings, which took place around false information about strangers coming into areas and trying to steal kidneys. And then people were beaten to death, or trying to kidnap children, and then people were beaten to death. And that, of course, around that, there was a lot of talk about how this is illiterate village citizens who are just have no idea. They look at something, they hear it, they believe it, and therefore they act on it, and people are being murdered because of this. And the question is there any truth in that? And we're going to look at that. And then finally, freedom of speech is absolute and must be maintained at all costs, otherwise democracy dies. And this is something which is so complex and so embedded in political theory that we're going to take a bit of time to examine that towards the end of the talk. At the start of our book, which this is almost like a little review of our book to give you a sense of what's in there, we look at definitions of naming of hate speech, extreme speech, dangerous speech, toxic speech, and we ask also how are these encoded into legal and policy regimes. And I quote from the book, "There is no universally accepted definition of hate speech, and it doesn't exist in international law, even though both hateful content and its consequences have been all too clear, particularly during the 1930s and 40s in Europe, and with the spread of social media and smart devices since 2000. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, adopted by the UN in 1966, specifically Article 20 of this, states that any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law." So you can see that there's a connection between discrimination, hostility, and violence with the word hate. In 1997, the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers, in its recommendation R 9720, defined hate speech as all forms of expression which spread, incite, promote, or justify racial hatred, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, or any other form of hatred based on intolerance, including intolerance expressed by aggressive nationalism and ethnocentrism, discrimination and hostility against minorities, migrants, and people of immigrant origin. If we were to take these definitions seriously, I would suggest that several million people, certainly several million people in Brazil, several million people in India, and possibly several million people across the European Union should probably be prosecuted and put in prison at the moment. Going down the legal route, therefore, only gets us so far. And we all know that it's quite easy to ignore legal arguments when all the law enforcement is closing their eyes to what is actually going on in front of them. So arguments abound about how things like jokes or fictional misrepresentations about particular groups do or do not constitute hate speech in many contexts. And evidence mounts that anti-hate speech laws are being used selectively by majority communities. So let's say by white majority communities in the US and the UK, by the Buddhist majority community in Sri Lanka and the Buddhist majority community in Myanmar against minorities to stifle all forms of dissent. Therefore, law enforcement are deeply implicated in both these tendencies in the context that we studied. Meanwhile, newer, customized, disguised, and more vicious forms of trolling, deep fakes, visual propaganda, and dehumanizing content are circulated online daily and used to initiate and legitimize violence offline as well. If we were to sit there and tell you how many pieces, individual texts of hate that we viewed over the course of the last 5 years, it's likely that someone would have a nervous breakdown. We found ourselves in tears at the end of every day. We found ourselves viewing death on a daily basis. And today I made a conscious choice not to show you any of the materials that we viewed, because on some occasions we've showed these materials and people in the audience have felt horribly triggered because they include rape threats, death threats, rape scenes, scenes of people with body parts hacked off. Even describing it is horrendous. So we're not just talking about someone calling someone else a bitch or calling someone else a racist name online, although that is a large part of what we look at. We're also talking about quite extended videos of things that look like real people and probably are real people being murdered in broad daylight. Contextual and intertextual analysis of online hate reported by those at the receiving end is one route towards understanding the connections between historical oppression, violence, and discrimination and contemporary online hate. And this is something that people who go at the subject from a technological angle tend not to want to do, because thinking about historical context of oppression actually seems to complicate things for AI and algorithms. So we came up with our own definition of hateful content based on the work we'd been doing in the thousands and thousands of instances that we'd looked at. We define it as online content which demeans, dehumanizes, stereotypes, perpetuates discrimination against, and/or initiates or legitimizes violence against individuals or groups based on protected characteristics such as social class, caste, race, religion, ethnicity, gender, sex, sexual orientation, disability, neurodiversity, age, language, body size, and political orientation. There may well be issues that we have not raised here, and we are aware of that. And also we'll speak, at least in future we will speak, and once the book is out, we will speak about how much many of these things overlap with each other. And so it's impossible to disentangle them. But what did we do? Well, we undertook several different types of analysis at the same time. We undertook a systematic textual analysis, in addition to a political economic analysis of large networked companies such as Facebook. And we also did a lot of deep listening work with individuals, groups, and people. Social media hate, including dehumanization, stereotyping, visual discrimination, and propaganda, performs an ideological and discursive role in everyday life, particularly in the arena of identity politics and geopolitics. And people often think it's only in the position of identity politics, but it's actually geopolitics which benefits a lot from large spreads of hate. We could talk about how country after country fell to the far right after 2014. So it was 2014 India, 2016 the US, 2018 Brazil. This is no accident, no accident. These audiovisual texts lend themselves to a legitimization of particular powerful interests through a range of techniques. And I'm summarizing here the work of dozens of scholars, many from India and many from the Middle East in this particular area. It's also widely argued and accepted that the context of production and consumption alter the connotative meanings and the repertoires of codes accessible to interpreters. That is, if you are a group of people who are receiving on a daily basis a series of text messages on WhatsApp, some of which say just good morning, and some of which say, good morning, let's praise this God, and some of which say, good morning, let's praise this God. This is another good day to go out and kill X group of people. That forms a repertoire of hate in which the very first good morning is also part of the chain. So we suggest that the groups of people receiving this around their dinner tables, while they're cooking food, when they're commuting to the office, when they're standing in line at the bank, all of that contextual information matters in terms of how hate is perceived, received, how much it can shock, how much it can actually end up having an effect on the person that receives it. And then finally, the political economic context. The implications of the intersection of these sets of ideas, that is the political economic and the visual, are not always clear to the hundreds of thousands of paid digital moderators and content censors for social media companies. As you all know, or maybe some of you don't know, large social media companies tend to outsource all of their moderation and content. Teams are based in countries which are not the countries which are using WhatsApp or Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. Content moderation teams are often based in a third country, which is not the country of origin of the company and not the country of the language which is being moderated. So in some cases, what this means is if you have a term which comes up, let's say in Oriya, or a term which comes up in Bengali, or a term which comes up in Tamil, the moderators who are based in the Philippines have been given a very clear set of guidance on what to look for in terms of English, but they have no idea how to deal with content which is transliterated. So this is just sort of, I'm making a connection to the last speaker's wonderful talk on language, to suggest that there are multiple different ways in which this plays out in terms of how hate speech slips through the system and becomes part of the online ecosystem. Or alternatively, someone might say, well, I'm posting a happy birthday message. And in that happy birthday message, you have an example of a Christian or a Muslim or a Jewish person who are dressed up with their headdress is coronavirus. And it says happy birthday. The moderators just read the happy birthday and they let it through. And when someone from the country says, actually, sorry, this is an example of hate speech because you're defining a whole group of people as somehow implicated in coronavirus spread, the digital team says, no, sorry, this has not been picked up either by our algorithm. This is not on our list of things to cut. And it's not those people's fault. It's the fact that that's how the companies operate. Their whole political economic structure is actually to ignore hate and to allow it to pass through, because if they didn't, they wouldn't make profits in those countries. They want to appeal to the largest number of people, and often the largest number of people is already implicated in hate. And so the following point, underestimation of the role of politicians and legacy media and social media profit and ideology is also dangerous. And it clearly is something that we do at our peril. So what does in-depth listening involve? We did it through interviews, focus groups, and ethnography, and often people already have a theory about something. They go away, they speak to 10 people, and they come back and they say, okay, well, these people have confirmed our theory. We had lots and lots of assumptions that we wanted to test, but we had no initial theories about how hate speech was affecting people or how hate speech was affecting politics or groups. We were coming at it from the perspective of an interest in how one might understand who are the people who are passing on disinformation and who are the people being affected by disinformation. We had very open minds about that. So alongside textual analysis, research methods such as interviews and ethnography proved useful in understanding the embedding and legitimization of histories of violence and fascist imaginaries across media and context. And I want to say this upfront, we deliberately chose in this book, unlike the WhatsApp research that we did before this, we chose not to talk to the trolls. We chose not to talk to the people who were making this disinformation and misinformation. We chose to focus on the people who were being affected by it, the people who were within groups that were constantly othered. So we interviewed more than 100 individuals. We conducted 20 focus group discussions and had 15 expert interviews in Brazil, India, Myanmar, and the UK, supplemented by a textual analysis of 3,000 social media posts drawn from Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And all of that required an enormous amount of ethical permission to get and to do. Training AI and algorithms to detect and remove hate speech online without doing this kind of prior rigorous contextual work with human beings turns out to be both biased and counterproductive. So what did we find? Well, of course, just as I said to you now, we found that hate is profitable for big business and for politics. And we spoke to a lot of paid and unpaid fact checkers. We spoke to people who work both explicitly for or explicitly with large social media companies like Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook and Google and YouTube. And we found that at a time when hate speech and fake news are being circulated on platforms such as Facebook and YouTube more than ever, all our cases actually also implicate mainstream politicians and old media in disinformation and hate. So here I'm saying, if the lens is firmly on social media, if the lens is only on social media in terms of the dissemination of disinformation and hate speech, what we're going to find is we don't understand what's going on. What we're going to find is we come up with problematic and probably false assumptions, because what happens is that the displacement of blame for this social media hate ecosystem tends to happen onto the large companies. And in no way does that mean I do not hold these large companies very responsible for what they are doing. It should be clear to you from the pictures that I've got up on this slide that the tie-ins and tie-ups between politicians on the far right in Brazil, in India, in the UK, Myanmar, and Facebook have been absolutely pivotal in causing pogroms and probably in causing genocide. And we say that very explicitly in chapter 2 of our book. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is that if we just take all these revelations about social media at face value, and we say, okay, these people are allowing hate to go untackled. They're allowing it to go because they know that that's going to bring in the audience. You don't ask two crucial questions. First crucial question is, what is going on in mainstream media while all of this horrible, violent, aggressive, discriminatory discussion is going on social media? So what's mainstream media doing? Is it just playing music or going back to the 1950s, Hindi film songs, or is it actually also replicating and in fact producing some of the hate that gets circulated on social media? And number two, and these politicians who keep threatening to put social media in jail and take people to court and for not doing enough to stop hate, what are they doing? And actually, if you tackle it properly and you interview them and you trace their speeches, you'll see that a lot of the hate speech on social media, it's generated by these same politicians, often on their social media accounts, but also often simply in their speeches to their party workers, to their aides, and to large gatherings of their followers. So here we have two crucial facts to remember if we're going to look at the social media infrastructure. Communicative practices and socio-political contexts are absolutely linked in terms of how social media disinformation and social media hate travel in the world in which we live. So go between our sisters and friends and aunties and our colleagues, and then suddenly find something has gone viral. So the first thing we found was transmediality. That is, a single narrative springs up across different media sites. Social media then act in tandem with ideas, tropes, messages, and stereotypes which circulate more widely in the public domain. I remember 30 years ago, when maybe some of you were not born yet, I was having a conversation with a colleague in India who just dropped into the conversation. And this colleague was worked in a hospital. I won't say any more about them. They worked in a hospital and they said, well, we find X, Y, and Z keep coming to see us. And this is because, and then they used the name of this person's community. And they said, because this community tends to be dirty. This was 30 years ago. There was no Facebook. There was no Instagram, there was no TikTok, there was no WhatsApp, but what there were, and you will recollect very clearly what was happening 30 years ago in India, were mixtapes. And what there was television, and what there was Hindi films and multiple vernacular films and music. And what there were politicians going on a big yatra and standing on their bus and their train and shouting and talking about what they were going to do and demolishing things. So 30 years ago, this colleague, very, very sort of just in passing, telling me about their day at the hospital, mentioned that they thought that there were a large number of infections of X type amongst this community because this community was dirty and this community didn't wash. And of course, I challenged it, and I've spent the last 30 years either losing those kinds of colleagues and friends or challenging those kinds of things. But the point is, these tropes, these ideas, which are attached to hate and to disinformation, have existed for decades. They weren't generated by social media. And transmediality means that you can encounter the same trope, the same idea that X community reproduces faster than Y community, or they have too many children, or they are trying to convert everyone to their religion, or they're like maggots. They keep coming onto the shores of this great country, Britain, and eating up all our food, or whatever it is. Those kinds of tropes exist quite apart from both media and social media. They get circulated, they get amplified, but they don't call them into being. Intertextuality, that is the actual visual and auditory use, mixed use of clips and issues and ideas from different types of media. So TV clips, fan pages from Facebook, all contribute content across multiple genres and are easily edited and recirculated on WhatsApp, Instagram, Messenger, etc., etc. Mainstream TV news contains politically motivated hate speech and perpetuates stereotypes that act as an incitement to violence on a daily basis. We did some form of content analysis or the other repeatedly over the course of the last 5 years, looking at the connections between mainstream media in India, mainstream media in the UK, for instance, talking about the EU and Brexit, mainstream media in India talking about Pakistan, talking about Pulwama. And each time there was a rise in screaming hate levels on mainstream media, was an equivalent rise in screaming hate levels on social media. So there was a connection between incitement to violence online and offline. And finally, the media literacy argument was something not that we want to debunk the notion of media literacy, but we also want to point out to you that actually this is a really dangerous thing to come up with as a single solution to social media hate. Users do go to multiple sites. They are media literate and they trust various different sources. And when all of the sources they go to tend to verify hateful misinformation, thus legitimizing disinformation or creating dangerous skepticism about all sources, this is deeply, deeply problematic. People are not foolish. They won't just believe one person telling them one thing. They go and they check and they find the same false belief and idea repeated again and again in different places. So I'm just going to quote from one of the pieces we quote from in our book. The story that was spread via Bolsonaro's social media channels, this is back in 2017, was that Haddad had created a gay kit, which he planned to introduce in primary schools so that children from the age of 6 would be encouraged to become gay. In fact, Haddad, as Brazil's former Minister for Education and alongside other politicians, had promoted an educational program for primary school students to understand sexual diversity and to combat homophobia. And we're talking about a country where there are multiple murders of gay and trans people on a daily basis. This hateful and mendacious but politically effective campaign culminated when deep fake videos of Fernando Haddad implicating him and his ministers and supporters in deviant sexual practices, and in particular in pedophilia, were circulated in a targeted manner on Facebook, on WhatsApp, and particularly on WhatsApp, towards sections of the Catholic and evangelical population, and in particular towards middle-aged women, swinging them away from the Workers' Party at the last minute in the 2018 election. It is not a huge leap for you to think about India. It is not a huge leap for you to think about what's being done regularly, what was done in 2018 and 2019, in 2013 and 2014. Beatrice Broadca, a journalist, researcher, and founder of the NGO Worlds Heal the World, consistently describes the views, values, and behaviors of powerful leaders in government in Brazil are linked to social media hate amongst the population. She says, most hate crimes in Brazil today are generated by racial prejudice. Gender comes in second place, and in third place, we find homophobic crimes. On social media, we see a high incidence of racist messages, homophobic messages, and political ideological messages, especially after Bolsonaro's election. We have a president who reinforces and legitimizes this kind of narrative. Bolsonaro and his ministers are very active on Twitter, and they use this platform to post hate messages against the left, as if any person who diverged from the government was an enemy. Do you recognize this from India? I'm sure you do. This is their narrative. Besides the ideological side, there's also the racist one. The government is composed mostly of white people. They don't talk about diversity. They're extremely homophobic. During Carnival, the president himself reinforced stereotypes that exist in relation to homosexuals. When authorities legitimize hate speech, we expect that some people will start reproducing this behavior. We are seeing far-right groups proliferating, groups that actively hate homosexuals, and they don't even use subtle language. On Facebook, you'll find posts defending killing gays and lesbians in the name of a clean society, in the name of a Christian society. African or African Brazilian religions are frequently attacked. This is closely linked to racism too. So we see then, in the case of Brazil, but also in the case of the UK, in the case of India, and certainly in the case of the Rohingya in Myanmar, a targeted violence, which is linked to the social media hate and absolutely inextricable from it. Amongst significant sections of both urban and rural caste Hindus and evangelical white or white identified Brazilians, there exists widespread distrust, hatred, contempt, and suspicion towards critical dissenting citizens and towards those belonging to groups such as Dalits, Muslims, Christians, Adivasis, LGBTQIA in one case, and Afro-Brazilians, indigenous peoples, LGBTQIA, and leftists in the other. In both countries, an intersection of gender with any of these other criteria can prove fatal for those who speak out. And it won't have escaped your notice that many women politicians who have spoken out against hate in Brazil have found themselves dead. Within social media groups run by those from dominant conservative, either Hindu or white communities, a dominant hegemonic opinion is established. Humanitarian opinions, especially critical of the government or the ruling party and its ideology, can lead to online bullying and offline consequences. Police complaints about sedition or physical violence for anti-national activity. Have you ever sat at a household function and an aunt or an uncle or a grandmother made a casually anti-Muslim remark or anti-Dalit remark, and you did nothing? Have you ever been in a WhatsApp group where someone said something negative about a politician from a minority community and you said nothing? Your silence is part of this dominant hegemonic opinion. It's understandable. Fear is understandable, but it's part of that. There's an affective element, a strong feeling of fear and emotion and hate, a strong feeling of sickness and anxiety, which is part of these WhatsApp messages. What makes them stand out in the flow of other mundane content? These are particularly inflammable during sensitive occasions, i.e. during elections, cross-border conflicts, religious festivals. And there are other colleagues of mine, especially in the Oxford Internet Institute and other places, and MIT and Harvard and across India, who are doing amazing work, including colleagues at Alt News, Pratik Sinha and colleagues who have done wonderful, much better work than we could do on how there are spikes in this kind of content at certain points. I quote now 2 quotes from our book, just to give you an illustration of the kinds of things that are happening to people. So this is a recipient of hate speech speaking in Brazil. The right use disinformation as a strategy. The groups that support the government using bots are very active. They are professionals. Some don't necessarily share the ideology. They're just being paid to do it. So we avoid posting photos showing where we live. We avoid posting family photos. We are careful not to say where our kids go to school. They're attacking our loved ones attacking our loved ones as part of their strategy. Some people send emails saying, I know where your kids go to school. This is more common than you imagine. It happens all the time. There's another fact-checking agency that fact-checked Bolsonaro's speech at the UN, and they are still being attacked for that. Another recipient of hate speech in Brazil says, they, the far right, call you a hooker and worse. It's always an attack against our bodies, our existence, our mental capability. It's always linked to sex, like what happened to, and then she names some of the people who have had horrendous experiences with trolls. The list of women who've been through this is endless. There was an account with a statue in the profile picture that sent me an inbox message every day saying, I'll shoot you in the face, you whore. It's always a statue, a comic strip, but it's not a bot because they react to reality, they talk back. So hateful misinformation and disinformation. Let's come up to the meat of the presentation, which is really a typology. So we found overwhelming content which compels forwarding, creating a sense that mainstream media is hiding the real news from you. For instance, there's a flood of refugees trying to get into Britain, or Afro-Brazilians are worshipping Satan. These kinds of really compelling, overwhelming images, which are accompanied by visuals of actual floods or actual Satan worshippers. nationalism and ethno-religious racial bigotry. If you live in India, you can't possibly have escaped looking at this. The majority community develop a narrative of false victimhood. Oh, poor us, we are soon going to be a minority in our country. These people are procreating or converting people at a terrible rate. There are calls for retaliation, which are circulated and linked to physical violence against othered groups and dissenters. There are films of violence against othered groups by perpetrators. Circulation of these films of atrocity and violence is used as both a warning and a humiliation, and apathy or collusion of law enforcement is absolutely the order of the day, both in Brazil and in India. In the UK, it's a little different, and there may be some apathy, but the police would be forced to act if you brought them the kinds of things that come up in India and Brazil. Religious themes are reinforcing membership of exclusive religious communities as if any syncretic tradition is impossible. There are illusions of historical superiority and modes of explaining daily life. You might think this is crazy. Why are we talking about history? But if you get 2,000 memes in the course of a year coming at you again and again through social media, it's sort of reinforcing a notion of certain types of identities. Gender, violent misogyny, patriarchal banality in porn, sex tapes, rape threats, rape videos. I can't tell you the number of things that we've looked at, and self-censorship leading to depression and suicide amongst the women who are being targeted. And then the depression and suicide is taken online by others and mocked and used to humiliate the families. A typology of perpetrators and recipients tells us the following: that hate, dehumanization, misinformation, and disinformation online spreads largely due to ideology and prejudice rather than to ignorance or illiteracy or to social media affordances. So here I'm dealing with some of the themes that I brought up at the beginning. Highly media literate, upper caste, urban, Hindu, or white men and women, and there are a larger and larger number of women in this, play a larger role in creating and forwarding disinformation and misinformation and administering groups to spread it than users with lower education levels or those from minoritized groups. That might seem absolutely logical to you, but this shocks so many people when we talk about it in ordinary cafe settings. In each of our case countries, Brazil, India, UK, and Myanmar, historically othered groups who have faced histories of pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial violence are more likely to be the targets of hate and dehumanization and discrimination online than those from majority and powerful groups. Within minoritized groups, those with intersections of identity with being a woman and or LGBTQIA are much more violently targeted. I'm coming to the end of the talk, just 2 more slides. Our theoretical framework aims to disrupt simplistic binarisms that assume a separation of online hate from offline politics and history. Both scholarly and corporate technological attempts to discuss online hate include a disavowal and underplaying of the social, political, and historical context that explain the specific circumstances under which some groups have systematically dominated other groups, thereby supplying the grounds on which hate can be manufactured, rationalized, legitimized, and normalized. Rather than focusing on the speech itself or on the affordances of social media itself, we relied on situating users' experiences in a historical and contextual setting to emphasize the systemic ways in which elements are interrelated to comprise what we call an ecosystem of online hate. So let's look back finally at our opening assumptions. So in the opening, I suggested to you that the literature says clueless and cunning social media companies are lax with policies and they're responsible for a rise in hate and hate crimes. What we found was that social media companies are far from clueless. They clearly prioritize profit over lives. This won't be a surprise to those of you who study social media companies. It won't be a surprise to those of you who teach about capital and capitalism and neoliberalism, but it is a surprise to a lot of the people who work for those social media companies and who thought that they were actually taking a responsible corporate social responsibility position and doing good. And therefore, finding this out and saying it very clearly can come as a real shock to the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who work in those roles in those companies. Social media itself and its affordances are responsible for a rise in hateful materials. Actually, the speed and reach of social media does contribute to the pace of hateful dissemination. There is no question about that. We would not say that things haven't changed. Things have changed. Things have changed since 1992. Things have changed since 2002. Things are worse. But what is worse is not the type of disinformation that's being spread. That has been there. That's been there in the 1930s, 1940s, long before the advent of social media, but the speed and reach, definitely. What about the question of Russian and Pakistani trolls and bots? Are they spreading stuff? Well, while there are certainly a small percentage of bots, mostly hateful, dehumanizing, disinformation, misinformation is actually organized. So most of this misinformation, disinformation is organized and homegrown or diaspora grown and not from a foreign hand. Venezuela is not interfering in Brazil's social media ecosystem. Russia did not cause Brexit. British far-right and right-wing and conservative politicians had a huge hand in causing Brexit. Similarly, in India, there is no foreign hand coming in and from China or coming in from Pakistan and doing all kinds of disinformation. It isn't even a social media cell of a left group doing it. It's actually radical right-wing groups associated with the government who are doing all of this stuff. Question about illiterate or media literate citizens are spurring the rise of mediated misinformation. Well, actually, absolutely the opposite is what we found. Highly educated, digitally literate citizens from majoritarian and ideologically predisposed towards hate and supremacism are spurring the rise of hateful disinformation and misinformation. Completely the opposite of what so many people think. If you teach them more digital skills, they're going to take those digital skills and use them against anti-authoritarian groups, against democratic groups, against secular groups. And that's what they're doing in Brazil, and that's what they're going to do in India. Freedom of speech is absolute and must be maintained at all costs, except when it comes to criticizing the state or politicians or laws or states which are friendly to one's own state or wars engaged in by one's government, and so on and so forth. And what we say, and this of course is a normative claim in the book, freedom of speech has to be defended from those who wish to claim that dissidence and critique are dangerous, but freedom of speech can also never be absolute, i.e. freedom to say hateful things, but must be negotiated along with other rights such as the right to life and dignity, which I think absolutely trump freedom of speech. Okay, I'm going to end there. I'm bang on 40 minutes, so thank you very much for listening.
Hello. I think Alina has a question. No, even I think Professor Dixit. You can speak, or should I read? It's very illuminating and thought-provoking research, and I'm curious to know if you have given a thought to this aspect, that how the recipients of hate speech have encouraged that experience, what have been their strategies, and whether this has changed their ways of reading visual text and image both.
Yes, what a great question. And yes, absolutely. That's a significant portion of each of the chapters of our book. Sri Ranjan, perhaps if you mute, because I'm getting a lot of feedback. Could you mute your microphone, because I'm getting a lot of feedback from your, thank you. So yes, we've looked at that in every single chapter that we wrote, and there are multiple different experiences of this, particularly women, particularly Muslim women and Black women have had almost nervous breakdowns in relation to this, to the point where they've been trolled and hated on so much that they can't look at particular social media again. So there are 3 or 4 different ways in which they respond to this. People have responded by getting organized. So they organize themselves into groups, let's say groups of women journalists or Black feminist groups or Muslim dissident groups, and they try in these groups, or Dalit women's groups, and they try in these groups to look out for each other and support and help each other and report to social media companies. Of course, social media companies are deeply disappointing in how they respond to the reporting of hate speech online. And that's because I've just outlined to you the context of social media companies. It's almost all, although not entirely all, about profit at the top. It's about allegiances with political ideologies, which are on the right and the far right at the top, although not in the middle and at the bottom of these social media companies. at the middle and the bottom, they're just pressured by the sheer volume of what they're having to deal with. So they're deleting, very, very sort of common tropes in terms of misogyny and in terms of pornography. And they don't understand how something that's targeted at a Black woman, or they don't want to understand how something that's targeted at a Muslim woman is necessarily equally harmful or damaging as some of the more openly pornographic materials that they're censoring on a daily basis. And so you can spend 3 months reporting just one incident of hate speech against you, and then you can get a little note from Twitter saying, you're right, this was a violation of our terms. And then just that one message that was sent to you, maybe it was a picture of you taken from your social media profile with a gun to your head, or maybe it was a picture of your daughter walking to school, that'll be taken down. But the perpetrator is allowed to remain on the social media platform. Nothing is done to them, or their account is suspended for 1 day as a warning, and they're taken down. So these constant attempts, so one is reporting, one is getting organized, and the third one is getting off a particular platform. This has a hugely damaging effect on people's mental health, on their fear for their loved ones' well-being. And of course, in cases, there have been people who've been actually approached on the street, recognized because of their talks and their work and their human rights work. They've been approached on the street by groups which could become mobs. They've been harassed. They've been harassed at their workplaces. They've had letters sent to their workplaces. I used to get on a regular basis, both death threats and rape threats, and talk about how my sons would be murdered, how somebody was going to rape me and teach me how to be a true nationalist. And I'm not even really on social media. I just work on social media. So, you can see this kind of thing has a massive effect on organizing. It makes a lot of people think, well, we can't use the space as we want to organize. And you'll read much more of that when the book comes out. I hope that answered your question.
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Since 2014, we all are observing that political vocabulary has changed dramatically. There is paradigm shift. And as it is called as WhatsApp University sarcastically. And on the other hand, we know that mainstream media, if I use the word Godi media, as Ravish Kumar says, and textbooks are, right now they are talking about all these Hindutva propaganda. Okay, so right now every outlet is dominated by right wing. So how do you see that? I mean, the next generation will learn that, Gandhi had committed suicide or like that. All these things are being circulated. So how do you see, what is the way out? Actually, this is quite general question, but this is really concern.
It's a huge concern. Sorry, would you mind muting again? Thank you. So it's a huge concern. I totally agree with you. And this is the number one question that my students, when we work together on these issues, they ask this question. They feel completely overwhelmed by the amount of takeover, co-option, and propaganda that's taking place in mainstream media, based and in every country, in Germany, in the UK, and the US, and Brazil, you name it, it seems to be happening. Today, we should say yay Chile, because clearly in the Chilean election, you had just a narrow marginal victory against a fascist politician. But, you've got to celebrate where you can. So 3 things to say about that. I don't have an answer. That's thing number 1. Thing number 2, the people at Shaheen Bagh and the people in the anti-CAA and anti-NRC protests actually managed to get their message far more widely heard than you would have assumed was possible in a world in which almost all the mainstream media is absolutely controlled. So the question of why is that? And of course, why is that is because social media also enables a multitude of other smaller dissident groups to continue to operate despite the best efforts of law enforcement and the government to shut them down and call them terrorists and anti-nationals. So there is still some scope for that kind of organizing. And number 3, I think there is a kind of international solidarity between groups working against these organizations. So for instance, there's much more linking up between social media fact checkers now in Europe and the UK and the US and India than there was 10 years ago. So while the far right networks much more effectively than humanitarian causes do, at least some people are catching up. And what that means is that this tends to be younger people. So contrary to what people say, which is that fascism is a young people's game or a young people's wave, I would actually say that fascism is a middle-aged, and older people's game and an older people's wave across continents. And I think that holds pretty good in all of our case study countries and in the US as well. So younger people are slightly more open at the moment to fact checking, to being told this, that, and the other is not as it seems. This is not necessarily just a good thing, because it also means that they're open to some really strange conspiracy theories, which are moving in, they're not neither right nor left. They're just sort of either libertarian or anti-medical or anti-expert. But it does mean that there is room for really good interventions in schooling and in universities. And if people like us don't take those chances and don't openly declare ourselves, I think we are also complicit in what's going on.
Vijaya Singh, ma'am, please. Unmute yourself, ma'am.
Hi. Hello, Professor Banaji. Really wonderful presentation. I really loved it. I was just thinking of what you said earlier about, that hate is something that has always existed. And, I'm thinking of the Babri Masjid demolition, which happened 30 years ago, which you also referred to, how, this hate already existed, but of course, the arrival of social media, as you also said, only makes its circulation so much faster and easier, right? But I was also wondering, what would you say, or rather, would you kind of contextualize it in larger terms, in terms of not just the socio-political context in which these things are happening, but also in terms of just the kind of the way in which technology itself has embedded itself into our lives, like in the sense that what Baudrillard talks about, how the hyper real, like the real is just not accessible anymore, even if we may try to fact check and do whatever, but the access to real is just kind of really impossible, because there are just multiple copies circulating all the time.
I think that's it's a hugely important point, and you've made very sort of illuminating interventions all the way through the talks, and I think this one too. And I would be foolish to say to you, no, that's not the case. I mean, I think the point is we have to accept that that is the case, and then ask ourselves, what do we do in a situation in which that is the case, in which you have these multiple copies of things that could or might or might not be real? So do we simply theorize it as we live in a post-truth era, there's nothing we can do about it? Or do we actually start to excavate ways of having better evidence, ways of finding out how each of these, these recordings of reality or sort of misrecordings or misrepresentations of reality are in line with a particular political ideology, and how do we teach our children and the people that we work with and the people that maybe, if you're a journalist, the people you speak to, how do you teach them to recognize those things? Because you could just throw your hands up and give up, or you could be a techno-determinist and say, well, we'll get better and more sharp technology to chase the evil technologies and make it better, and then the evil ones will come up with some new way of having a deep fake, and then we just we're on a spiral there. And that is all happening as well, because I speak regularly to these tech companies, and one of the things they're doing is they're saying, tell us what we can do to train the algorithms better. Okay, that's a line that they just keep feeding me, and I'm like, even if I tell you 2,000 things to do to train the algorithms, Modi is still going to be shaking hands with Zuckerberg, and the person in charge of Facebook India is still going to be anti-Muslim, and that's your problem. So I think it's three things to say. One, you sort of said it in a passive way, as if these things have just become embedded in our everyday lives. In 2016, the tie-up between Jio and the Modi government intentionally started to embed these things in our lives, okay? Two, when we have new things around education and surveillance, when teachers are being watched on laptops provided by Jio, surprise, surprise, when people are told not to use foreign firms' software, but to move to an Indian pay app, and therefore when it can be cut off at any moment when you do something that's not liked, we are being guided and pushed by both the politics and economy. So the political economy framework of India is pushing us towards that kind of infrastructure. We see the same thing happening in the UK and the same thing happening in Brazil. And the same thing happening in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Indonesia. It's really interesting how the infrastructure debate, which said it was going to deliver modernity, came along and delivered fascism. So I think it hasn't just happened.
Right.
Technology doesn't just come and then suddenly it's embedded in people's lives. Technology is embedded. And we've known that. Raymond Williams talked long ago about how the fact that the military invents particular forms of mediation, mediated technologies. And I think I go along with that argument that, you know, structures of sentiment are also being encoded within the apps at particular times. So when good morning isn't just, when the meme isn't just good morning, it's good morning and Hail Ram or Hail Mary. That's telling you something, that's pushing you in a particular ideological direction. And if that's what you have every day with your breakfast from your nani and you say, oh, it's nothing, it doesn't mean anything, that's banal nationalism or banal ethno-nationalism. You know, so we can use theory to help people to disaggregate what's actually happening. And the need for social media, the need for technology and connection is also something that's being developed on a regular basis. And it's messing with, you know, our mental health too. So, I mean, such a huge conversation, but thank you so much for bringing that up.
Thank you so much.
I think we seem to have come to the end of the day. You all must be so tired. Thank you for being so patient with us.
Hello. Thank you very much, ma'am. This was a really wonderful presentation. And it just reminded me of a famous quote by Mark Twain, who says, a lie can travel halfway around the world while truth is putting on its shoes. So I think we are living in post-truth era, digital nation with ethnic identities, and really we have to fight. It's like a right-wing wave all over the world. And you have rightly told us about online hate and how we can actually combat in the question answer session. So thank you very much. Is there any other question? If not, then yes, Alina is saying thank you very much to all the speakers. Yeah. Okay. So I think with this, today's session, all the sessions are over. We are looking forward to the tomorrow's session. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you all very much. Good to see you. Bye.
Yeah, bye.